Hello, science people! Today I want to talk to you about complete dominance, also known as dominant recessive or Mendelian genetics. Let's jump into it. So to help us understand dominant genetics, a tool that is most commonly used is called a Punnett Square, and that's developed by Dr. Punnett in the early 1900s. So let's start with a very simple Punnett Square. Let's do one on male and female children in humans. So if you have an XX chromosome, you are a female. If you have an XY, then you are a male. And so because our gametes, our sperm and egg, have only one of all of our chromosomes, that means a female can make two types of eggs. She can make an X and she can make an X. And so the male can make sperm that are either X or Y, okay? Because you're only going to put one chromosome in your gametes. And so males are making X and Y sperm, females are making X and X sperm. Okay, so now when we do a Punnett square, we do it for a specific trait. And so the trait that we're going to be doing it for right now is going to be male or female. So it doesn't matter what you put on top. I will put the female eggs on top and the sperm on the side, but it doesn't matter. And so the female can make eggs that are X or X. The male can make sperm that is X or Y. Now, if the first sperm fertilizes the first egg, then we are going to get XX. That will develop into a female child. If that first sperm fertilizes the second egg, then that is going to be XX. That will also be a female child. If that second sperm fertilizes that first egg, then we're going to get XY, which will be a male child. And if that second sperm fertilizes that second egg, then it's going to be XY. That will also be a male child. And so looking at this Punnett square, that means 2 out of 4, which of course we reduce to 1/2, will equal male children, and 1/2 of our squares will equal female children. And so this is how we can determine the chances of having a genetic inheritance. And so this checks out, right? You have a 50-50 chance of having a daughter or a son. And this is how it works. So a Punnett square is something where we take one specific characteristic, we take the possible genes or gametes from the mom and from the dad, and then we cross them in order to see the possible inheritance. And so in this situation, male and female, we have a 50% chance of having male children and a 50% chance of having female children. Now, for those of you who are new to this with the XX and XY, let me ask you, looking at this Punnett square, so who determines, the mom or the dad, the sex of the child? Well, if the mom can only make X eggs and the male is making the X and the Y, that means it's the sperm that determines the sex of the child. The mother has nothing to do with the sex of the child. It is the father that is choosing the sex of the child based on which sperm makes it, the X and the Y. So all of those British kings that were very mad at their wives for having all daughters, it was actually the sperm. It was the X sperm that was making it to the egg, causing those daughters. Okay, so now let's look at Mendel's situation with his purple and white pea plants. So looking at this image, he first crossed a purple and a white pea plant. Now, we know that purple is dominant and white is recessive. And so when we are writing the alleles, we use a capital letter to represent the dominant trait. So P is going to equal purple, and a lowercase p. Now, I always make my lowercases look a little funny just so we can recognize them as lowercase. So the lowercase p is going to equal white. And I'll explain that in a little bit. I'll explain why we don't use W for white. But we're going to use a capital letter for the dominant trait and a lowercase version of that dominant trait letter to equal the recessive trait. So since purple is dominant, we use an uppercase P for purple. And because white is recessive, we use a lowercase p to equal white. Okay, so let's look at this. So let's look at Father Mendel's plants, his pea plants. So that purple pea plant, we're going to do a Punnett square. So we're going to cross these two together. And so that purple pea plant had two purple alleles. So remember, alleles are versions of your genetics, of your genes. So it had two purple alleles. That was why it was purple. And that white pea plant had two copies of white. Okay? And there's no way of knowing this by just looking at them. Well, we know the white one, but we don't know the purple one. But we do know that he was dealing with true breeding pea plants. So we know that they were what you're going to find out homozygous. So let's say that that first square is going to be fertilized. That's that big P and that little p. And let's fill all of these in. And we always like to put the capital letter first before the lowercase, mainly because it looks nice, and we also want to have consistency. Okay, so now if we look at this, it does not matter which gamete fertilized which egg. No matter what, 100% of the offspring are going to be a big P, little p. Okay, so let's talk about some of our terminology. So if you have two of the same alleles, then we are going to call you homozygous. Homo meaning same, zygous like in a zygote, like in an offspring. So homozygous means you have two of the same alleles. If you have two different alleles for the same trait, we are going to call that heterozygous. And so hetero meaning different, so heterozygous. And so if you have two of the dominant alleles, we'll call you homozygous dominant. And if you have two of the recessive alleles, we will call you homozygous recessive. And so in our case with the pea plants, we had a homozygous dominant purple pea plant reproducing with a homozygous recessive white pea plant, and that gave us 100% heterozygous offspring. Now, what Father Mendel taught us was that whenever you have a dominant and a recessive trait together, the dominant trait is going to be the one expressed. It's going to be the one that shows up. And so if 100% of the children, the offspring of these plants, are heterozygous, even though they have a purple and a white allele, this is going to come out purple, because the whole purpose of the dominant recessive is that the dominant is the one that shows up. And so this is why when Father Mendel reproduced or crossbred his purple and white pea plants, 100% of the offspring were purple, and he said, wait, what happened? What happened to the white allele? Well, this is what happened. So next, Father Mendel, he took the offspring of that purple and white flower, and then he let it self-fertilize. And then what he got was 3/4 purple and 1/4 white. So let's replicate this using a Punnett square to help us visualize what had happened. Okay, so we know that the offspring of those two plants was heterozygous because it had a parent that was homozygous dominant purple and a parent that was homozygous recessive white. And so the alleles that this plant is going to use in its gametes are going to be dominant purple, recessive white, also dominant purple and recessive white. And so if we start crossing these in our Punnett square, you'll see that we have 1/4 is going to be homozygous dominant, 2/4, which is 1/2, is going to be heterozygous, and we have 1/4, which is going to be homozygous recessive. And so if we look at what do these turn out, how do these look? Okay, so let's write this out again. We have 1/4 of our squares is homozygous dominant, and we have 2/4, which is 1/2, is going to be heterozygous. And there's no heterozygous dominant or recessive. We just call it heterozygous. And then we have 1/4 is going to be homozygous recessive. So this is called their genotypes. Your genotypes are the genes that you inherit. But the phenotypes, think of geno as genes, pheno as physical. The phenotypes are what you look like. So let's look at what these plants would look like. So the homozygous dominant ones are going to be purple because they have 2 purple alleles. The heterozygous ones are going to be purple because they have a purple and a white, a purple and a white, and the purple is dominant. So they will also be purple. So if we add those up together, we got 1/2 and we got 1/4, or you can just count your squares here. That's going to be 3/4 are going to look purple. And then we look at the homozygous recessive. Because the homozygous recessive has 2 white alleles, no purple at all, the white is going to be what shows up. And so 1/4 of the pea plants are going to end up white. And if we look at Mendel's ratios here, that's what he saw. It's not that the white went away or skipped a generation. The white was always there. See, the white is here, the white is here, the white is here. But if you look at the parents, they had the white gene. It was there, it just wasn't showing up because the dominant one, this purple, is what took over. This is what showed up. This is what manifested. We call it expressed. That is what was expressed. So I want to talk to you about why dominant is dominant, why recessive is recessive. And they usually don't do this in textbooks for some reason, but I'm going to draw my terrible looking chromosome here. Okay, and so if you have a chromosome, and let's say where you have the trait for color, let's say that this trait is your purple, this is what makes you purple. And you have 2 chromosomes for every trait, and that's because you have a mom and a dad, so even plants have a mom and a dad. And so a plant that is homozygous dominant for purple, here you go, here's purple, purple. It has 2 copies of purple. And so when this goes to become a plant, it has 2 genes that say make purple. And so what happens? It makes purple. But what does it mean to be recessive? And so really, a recessive gene is a broken gene. So let's look at what that would look like. So let's say that we have a heterozygous pea plant. So it's got a purple allele and it's got a white allele. So what that means is it has the allele for purple and this white one is really just broken. So it means it makes nothing. And so in this pea plant, what you see is you have a gene to make purple and a gene to make nothing. And so if you say make purple and make nothing, it's going to read the purple. And so what happens is you get a purple pea plant. Now, in a homozygous recessive pea plant, you have 2 chromosomes, just like everything else. And what happens is you have 2 little p's, homozygous recessive. You have a broken allele for color and a broken allele for color. And so one doesn't say to make purple and another one doesn't say to make purple. And so in pea plants, what happens is that ends up looking white. But you didn't actually have the genes for white. White is just what happened when 2 of your purple alleles are broken. This is usually the case with dominant recessive alleles. Usually the dominant allele says to make something and the recessive one doesn't say anything. And that's really why one is dominant and one is recessive. It's because it's not really saying anything. And so in order for a recessive trait to show up, you have to have 2 copies of it. Let's look at a human version. Okay, so let's talk about dimples, right? So you have dimples on your cheeks. So dimples is a dominant trait. And so let's do a Punnett Square for one of these. And so let's say that I have a dad that has Dimples and they have 2 copies of it. And so since Dimples is dominant, you have D and D uppercase for Dimples. And let's say that I have a mom that has no Dimples. Well, because she has none, we know automatically that she is lowercase d because she doesn't have those dimples. And so if my mom and dad reproduce together, so my dad can make D and D, my mom can make little d, and this is going to give me heterozygous. And so if you are heterozygous for Dimples, what happens is you make Dimples. And so again, if we think about it on our chromosomes, what it is you have the gene to make Dimples, and then you have a gene that doesn't say to make Dimples. You're going to read the one that says make Dimples, and you're going to go ahead and make Dimples. And so this is how dominant and recessive works. So my mom, who didn't have any genes to make Dimples, that means that she had no alleles for Dimples, and then so she just didn't make Dimples because none of her genes said to do it. And this is what dominant recessive is. You either have a gene that says to make something or it's not there. And so just because something is dominant doesn't mean it is common. A lot of my students get this confused. They think that just because something is dominant that it's going to be common. Let's talk about having 6 fingers. Okay, so do you know anyone with 6 fingers? Having 6 fingers is not common, but the gene for 6 fingers is dominant. And the reason is the gene for 6 fingers says make an extra finger. And so I don't have 6 fingers on any of my hands. So that means that if we look at my 2 chromosomes, the place where it says to make a 6 finger, mine says nothing and nothing. And so what happens is I only end up with 5 fingers. Now let's say that somebody had 6 fingers and they had one parent that didn't have 6 fingers. That would mean most likely they are heterozygous. So that means one of their chromosomes says make 6 fingers and one of their chromosomes says make nothing, and what happens is they end up with 6 fingers. Well, let's do a Punnett Square for this. So let's say that you have a dad with 6 fingers. So that would mean that they're probably heterozygous because it's unlikely that they had 2 parents both with 6 fingers. So let's say that your dad had 6 fingers. That would probably mean that they had an allele for 6 fingers, and then they had one that didn't, just for 5. Okay, and then your mom had 5 fingers on both hands. And so what happens is we do this Punnett Square, and of course we wouldn't do it with numbers like this, but I'm just doing it for simplicity. And so when we look at this, what's going to happen is you're going to have 2 children that have, out of 4, if you had 4 kids, the odds are you'd have 2 children that had just the normal 5 fingers on both hands, and then you would have 2 kids that are heterozygous, meaning that they would also have 6 fingers. So when you have a person that is heterozygous reproducing with somebody that is homozygous recessive, what happens is a 50-50 chance. So you're going to have a 50-50 chance of having a kid that has that trait. So let's look at that ratio with Mendel's pea plants. Okay, so let's go back and let's talk about if a heterozygous pea plant, so here's heterozygous, was to reproduce with a white pea plant. And we know the white ones are homozygous recessive because that's the only way they'd be white. And so if we do this Punnett Square, it'll be a lot like our 6-fingered people. So if we put this together, it's going to be a 50-50 ratio. And so a heterozygous purple pea plant reproducing with a homozygous recessive white pea plant will give you 50% purple and 50% white. And this is happening because of the dominant purple allele. Now, none of the purple kids or the purple offspring are homozygous dominant. They're heterozygous, which means they're also carrying that white allele, but purple is what shows up. Okay, so this is just kind of an introduction into dominant and recessive alleles, but I hope you found this interesting, and I will see you next time with more genetics.